Hello, U.S. History. Welcome back to Varilla's videos. Today's lecture is going to be on two important movements of the later 1800s. One of them is populism, and the other one is progressivism. Both of them are going to be dealing with ways that our, our living can improve, how our government is operating, and they really sort of focus on different parts of the country. So I want to talk about populism first. So populism is dealing with our farmers. So this will be dealing with mainly farmers in the Midwest, a little out west, a little bit on the East Coast. But let's talk about the situation that farmers are facing really towards the end of the 1800s. Prices of their crops have dropped. And part of the reason why crop prices and agricultural products have seen a decrease in their prices is because of the fact that it's basically like over farming. Farmers were encouraged to grow as much of their crops as possible to help feed our country. But if you know anything about the laws of supply and demand, if there is a lot of your product, the supply is too much, prices tend to go down. And when prices go down, farmers ultimately are not able to earn enough money back from the sale of their crop. And therefore, they find themselves in debt. Once they are in debt, they're in the cycle of having to continually borrow money to keep their farms afloat. And what ends up happening is many farmers will lose their land. Farmers get angry. And they feel like neither the Democrats nor the Republicans are listening to their situation. So they are going to form a third party, and it's called the Populist Party or the People's Party. And when the Populist Party is formed, they are going to call for very specific ideas. The first one is going to be regulation of the railroads. Right now, the railroads were the key way that farmers get their products to the markets. And the railroad companies know this. So they purposely charge farmers a much higher price than they would charge someone, let's say, like Andrew Carnegie and his steel and iron ore. And the farmers know this. The problem is there's nothing they can do about it. So they're calling for the government to regulate the railroad industries more closely. They also feel like we need to incorporate some sort of secret ballot voting, some sort of anonymous voting when it comes to selecting party candidates, especially at the national conventions. They want it to be more of almost like a freedom of choice without having to bow down to pressure from influential party members, which is how they will cast ballots today at our national conventions. They're also going to call for the direct election of senators. And the reason why this is interesting is that up until really 1913, our two senators from each state are not chosen by us as voters. They were chosen by the state legislators. So, for example, in California, our state legislature meets in Sacramento. So that group in Sacramento would get together and pick our two senators. The people don't vote. Ultimately, this will become our 17th Amendment, that when we have our two senators chosen from each state, that we, the voters, get to vote for them. The other idea the populists come up with is something called a graduated income tax. And what this basically is an income tax that's going to be based on a percent of your income. That is how we pay our income tax today in 2020. But before the use of the graduated income tax, which, by the way, is the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, people were paying flat rate taxes, as in whatever rate the government decided, that's what you paid. So that type of tax is called a regressive tax, and that tends to hurt people that make less money. A graduated income tax is supposed to be more fair. You pay a percent, not a set amount, but a percent based on your income. And get ready, kids, right now for federal income tax, it's almost 30% of our income. Yikes. So the man you see pictured here is going to be the candidate the Populist Party nominates. His name is William Jennings Bryan, and he will be nominated in 1892 for the presidential election, and he will represent the Populist Party. But you know, as a third party, it's not going to look good. William Jennings Bryan Um, Even though he loses in 1892, he runs again in 1896. But that was the more famous election for him because it gets him on a national stage and gets him the attention of the Democrats. He's campaigning on something that's very controversial in the 1800s, and that is something called a silver-backed currency. We know that most of the time a currency is backed by gold, as in the amount that your dollar is valued at is based on its amount or its weight in gold. That's a very simplistic explanation. But gold we know is very expensive. Farmers want to create more of a state of inflation where they would deflate our currency and make it worth a little less. So by having a silver backed currency, it actually would devalue our dollar. And in the farmers' minds, it would help them get out of debt faster. So silver backed currency was not a very popular idea outside of the Populist Party, but it did make sense for the farmers in terms of helping them with their economic situation. In the end, William Jennings Bryan doesn't win, but he does create a legacy in terms of what makes him famous. And that is that he appears to be a candidate that appeals directly to the people. He seems like a regular person. He seems like he understands what farmers were going through. And he wasn't a farmer himself, but he spoke for them. And that was very important to the Populist Party. You do see some candidates after William Jennings Bryan embrace this style of candidacy where you want to connect with your voters. So that is the Populist Party and the populists. I want to switch over to progressivism now. And progressivism is really, I think, broken up into four categories and four types of progressives. These are reformers. They are people that see problems and want to fix them. So the first group of progressives are going to be the ones that are looking at social welfare. How can they help the people, specifically the poor? We're going to be learning about how our cities are really dirty places right now. There's a lot of problems in our cities. So the social welfare progressives are trying to fix that. They're trying to deal with like what you see in this problem here. You see three children literally sleeping in what looks like a stairwell. So they're trying to help the poor. They want to make sure that they want to use their influence or perhaps even their money for good. They also wanted to try and address and talk about something that nobody likes to talk about, especially in the age of Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, and that is the gap between the rich and the poor. This is the 1800s, the late 1800s. We are in the year 2020, and we're still talking about the gap between the rich and the poor. So as you can see, this is an ongoing issue that our country is trying to deal with. But the first group of progressives are the ones that we're going to call the social welfare progressives. They also will look at improving the lives of women and children specifically and trying to fight for protections for women and children in the workplace, for example. And as we read the excerpt from The Jungle, you know that children might need some protection in the workforce. Okay, next group of progressives are what we call the moral improvement progressives. This is the group that feels like we have to address some of our morals and maybe our social ills, and they are going to focus on alcohol. Look at the sign these women are holding. Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. This group of progressives are looking at something called the temperance movement. The temperance movement is basically a movement that is looking to ban alcohol in this country, that they feel the drinking of alcohol is what's contributing to the moral decline of our country. And if you know your history, they are going to be successful because they are going to help push through Congress the 18th Amendment, which will in fact ban alcohol. So if you're looking for a definition for temperance, it would be abstinence from alcohol, so abstaining from alcohol and staying away. But they feel a lot of our country's problems can be traced back to alcohol. There will be a few loopholes, like, for example, church services. If you are Catholic or any kind of Christian-based religion and have a communion that involves wine, that was okay. But some people argue that perhaps the temperance movement was also aimed, for example, at groups like the Germans, who were known for their beer drinking, that this might be a little bit and very subtle anti-immigrant type of movement. Okay, that's the second group of progressives, the moral improvement. Third group is the economic reforming group, and this is the group that's going to target business. They feel like government has let men like Carnegie and Rockefeller run amok, and that basically they want to create government policies and reforms that are going to limit big business. So they're against policies that favor big businesses, that favor monopolies. And so here is where you start to see some government reformers realize that business isn't always benefiting the customer, and that maybe that should be the other way around. Maybe the customer should get some protections. So this economic reform is going to be ongoing. It's going to build upon earlier acts like the Sherman Antitrust Act and pass laws like the Clayton Antitrust Act. They also are going to be looking at worker and consumer rights. So, for example, safer workplaces. So many of the progressives will see their causes kind of overlap a little bit, but they also want to make sure that customers have some protections, like, for example, false advertising. Up until the early 1900s, your label on your product could say anything. It could say it cures cancer, it cures heart attacks, even though your product has nothing to do with that. So this is going to be a group of progressives that are trying to make our food safer, our labels safer, and really give us as consumers more rights. The next group is going to be the group that's looking at efficiency, what we call economic efficiency. And this is going to be a group that's trying to see how can we make factories a little more productive and also more safe. So we're looking at the use of the assembly lines. We're looking at factories that can use mass production and produce a lot of something. They will use principles that we now call scientific management principles, where they're looking at productivity and how fast workers can work and how we can make sure that in an 8-hour work shift, for example, that workers are maximizing their potential. Some will argue that this actually is going to hurt workers in the long run, and that's where labor unions will have to step up a little bit. But in terms of worker efficiency, the idea, and men like Henry Ford will sort of perfect this, that if you can have a product created by the assembly line, in the long run, the price will come down, and that will help the consumer. So those are your 4 areas of the progressives. I have a couple pictures I just want to show you, and you're going to see some of these same images in your textbook later. But before we do that, there's a group that we're looking at called the progressives, specifically the reporters and journalists who are part of this movement, take on this nickname muckrakers. And these really were investigative reporters who are really exposing some of the ills of our country. And that's how the book The Jungle is written. It's written by the muckraker Upton Sinclair, who's going undercover to show America what it's like in some of these factories. So these are muckrakers who are writers, but they're also photographers. So Jacob Riis, very famous photographer, takes pictures of what he sees happening, and he wants to make a slideshow to show America's wealthy what is really happening. So here's one of his first images that we believe was taken circa 1890. So children sleeping in the street, again, a very common experience that people don't really want to talk about. Here's another one where they called it 5 cents lodging. So basically you can see here, I see at least 4 individuals, but no, I'm sorry, I think I see 5. So in this tiny little apartment, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 men living in very close quarters, kind of sleeping, in this, what is basically the size of probably your bedroom, maybe a little bit larger than that. And these are real images. So they think this picture was taken around circa 1889. So as we look at the muckrakers and sort of exposing these problems, we have to also look at, here's a cover from The Jungle. Here's an inside of one of those factories would have looked like. Gross, gross, gross. But the idea is that we are looking at the in a way, the reality, the behind the scenes that nobody wants to talk about. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop our notes on progressivism and populism. Hope you took some good ones, and I'll see you in class.